I hope with Judge Wilkins he will be given that chance to serve on this important court, and I yield the floor. I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. President.
Senator from Massachusetts.
I ask that the quorum be vitiated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today to talk about the retirement crisis in this country, a crisis that has received far too little attention and far too little response from Washington. I spent most of my career studying the economic pressures on middle-class families, families who worked hard, who played by the rules, but who still found themselves just hanging on by their fingernails. Starting in the 1970s, even as workers became more productive, their wages flattened out, while core expenses, things like housing and health care and sending a kid to college, just kept going up. Working families didn't ask for a bailout. Instead, they rolled up their sleeves, they sent both parents into the workforce. But that meant higher child care costs, a second car, and higher taxes. So they just tightened their belts more, cutting spending wherever they could. Adjusted for inflation, families today spend less than they did a generation ago on food, clothing, furniture, appliances, and other flexible purchases. And when that still wasn't enough to cover rising costs, they took on debt. Credit card debt, college debt, debt just to pay for the necessities. As families became increasingly desperate, unscrupulous financial institutions were all too happy to chain them to financial products that got them into even more trouble, products where fine print and legalese covered up the true costs of credit. Now, these trends are not new. There have been warning signs for years about what's happening to our middle class. One major consequence of these increasing pressures on working people, a consequence that receives far too little attention, is the dream of a secure retirement is slowly slipping away. A generation ago, middle-class families were able to put away enough money during their working years to make it through their later years with dignity. On average, they saved about 11% of their take-home pay while working. Many paid off their homes, got rid of all their debts, and retired with strong pensions from their employers. And when pensions, savings, and investments fell short, they could rely on Social Security to make up the difference. That was the story a generation ago, but since that time, the retirement landscape has shifted dramatically against our families. Among working families on the verge of retirement, about a third have no retirement savings of any kind, and another third have total savings that are less than a year's annual income. Many seniors have seen their housing wealth shrink as well. According to AARP, in 2012, 1 out of every 7 older homeowners was paying down a mortgage that was higher than the value of their house. And just as they needed to rely more than ever on pensions, employers are withdrawing from their traditional role in helping provide a secure retirement. 2 decades ago, more than a third of all private sector workers, 35%, had traditional defined benefit pensions, pensions that guaranteed a certain monthly payment that retirees knew they could depend on. Today, that number has been cut in half. Only 18% of private sector workers have defined benefit pensions. Employers have replaced guaranteed retirement income with savings plans like 401k plans that leave the retiree at the mercy of a market that rises and falls, and sometimes at the mercy of dangerous investment products. These plans often fall short of what retirees need, and nearly half of all American workers don't even have access to those limited plans. This leaves more than 44 million workers without any retirement assistance from their employers. Add all of this up, the dramatic decline in the individual savings and the dramatic decline of guaranteed retirement benefits and employer support in return for a lifetime of work, and we're left with a retirement crisis, a crisis that is as real and frightening as any policy problem facing the United States today. With less savings and weaker private retirement protection, retirees depend more than ever on the safety and reliability of Social Security. Social Security works. No one runs out of benefits, and the payments don't rise or fall with the stock market. Two-thirds of seniors rely on it for the majority of their income in retirement, and 14 million seniors, 14 million. This is the safety net that keeps them out of poverty. God bless Social Security. And yet, even Social Security has been under attack. Monthly payments are modest, averaging about $1,250. And over time, those benefits are shrinking in value. This puts a terrible squeeze on seniors. With tens of millions more financially stressed as they approach retirement, with more and more people left out of the private retirement security system, and with the economic security of our families unraveling, Social Security is rapidly becoming the only lifeline that millions of seniors have to keep their heads above water. And yet, instead of taking on the retirement crisis, instead of strengthening Social Security, some in Washington are fighting to cut benefits. Just this morning, the Washington Post ran an editorial mocking the idea of a looming retirement crisis. To make sure that no one missed the point, they even put the words retirement crisis in quotation marks. No retirement crisis? Tell that to the millions of Americans who are facing retirement without a pension. Tell that to the millions of Americans who have nothing to fall back on except Social Security. There is a $6.6 trillion gap between what Americans under 65 are currently saving and what they need to maintain their standard of living when they hit retirement. $6.6 trillion. And that assumes that Social Security benefits aren't cut. Make no mistake, there is a crisis. The call to cut Social Security has an uglier side to it too. The Washington Post framed the choice as more children in poverty versus more seniors in poverty. The suggestion that we have become a country where those living in poverty fight each other for a handful of crumbs tossed off the tables of the very wealthy is fundamentally wrong. This is about our values, and our values tell us that we don't build a future by deciding first who among the vulnerable will be left to starve. Look at the basic facts. Today's Social Security has a $2.7 trillion surplus. If we do nothing, Social Security will be safe for the next 20 years, and even after that, we'll continue to pay most benefits. With some modest adjustments, we can keep the system solvent for many more years, and we could even increase benefits. The tools to help us build a future are available to us now. We don't start the debate by deciding who gets kicked to the curb. We are Americans. We start the debate by figuring out how to create better efficiencies, how to make small changes that will make the system fairer, how to grow the pool of those who contribute, and how to rebuild a system that every single one of us can rely on to make sure there is a baseline in retirement that no one falls below. We don't build a future for our children by cutting basic retirement benefits for their grandparents. No, we build a future for our kids by strengthening our economy, by investing in education and infrastructure and research, by rebuilding strong and robust middle class in which every kid gets a chance, and the most vulnerable have a strong safety net. The most recent discussion about cutting benefits has focused on something called the chain CPI. Supporters of the chain CPI say it's a more accurate way of measuring the cost of living increases for seniors. This statement is simply not true. Chain CPI falls far short of the actual increases in costs that seniors face. Pure and simple. Chain CPI, it's just a fancy way to say cut benefits. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has developed a measure of the real impact of inflation on seniors. It's called the CPI-E, and if we adopt it today, it would generally increase the benefits for our retirees, not cut them. Social Security isn't the answer for all of our retirement problems. We need to find a way to tackle the financial squeeze that is crushing our families. We need to help families start saving again. We need to make sure that more workers have access to better pensions. But in the meantime, so long as these problems continue to exist and so long as we are in the midst of a real and growing retirement crisis, a crisis that is shaking the foundations of what was once a vibrant and secure middle class, the absolute last thing we want to do is cut Social Security benefits. The absolute last thing we should do in 2013, at the very moment that Social Security has become the principal lifeline for millions of our seniors, is allow the program to be dismantled inch by inch. Over the past generation, working families have been hacked at, chipped, and hammered. If we want a real middle class, a middle class that continues to serve as the backbone of our country, then we must take the retirement crisis seriously. Seniors have worked their entire lives and have paid into this system, but right now, more people than ever are on the edge of financial disaster once they retire, and the numbers continue to get worse. That is why we should be talking about expanding Social Security benefits, not cutting them. Senator Harkin from Iowa, Senator Begich from Alaska, Senator Sanders from Vermont, and others have been pushing hard in that direction. Social Security is incredibly effective, it is incredibly popular, and the calls for strengthening it are growing louder day by day. Mr. President, the conversation about retirement and Social Security benefits is not a conversation just about math. At its core, this is a conversation about our values. It is a conversation about who we are as a country and who we are as a people. I believe we honor our promises. We make good on a system that millions of people paid into faithfully throughout their working years. And we support the right of every person to retire with dignity. Thank you, Mr. President. I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The Republican leader.
I ask consent that further proceedings of the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
As I noted last week, despite the repeated promises of President Obama, millions of people are losing their health insurance they very much liked and were assured they could keep. It has been reported that so far 3.5 million Americans have lost their health insurance under Obamacare. That includes over 250,000 people in Kentucky, 1/3 people in Florida, and almost 1 million people in California. This is a serious problem that the President and congressional Democrats need to do something about. Unfortunately, they appear to be relying on half measures and creative accounting, not real solutions. For example, we learned over the weekend that the administration's goal is to have the website serve only 80% of users, which is probably why our Democratic colleagues want to spend 100% of their time discussing other subjects. Which brings us to the vote we'll have today. For the third time in this work period, the majority will have the Senate vote on yet another nominee to the D.C. Circuit. This is not because the court needs more judges. It's the least busy court in our entire country. In fact, it is far less busy now than it was when Senate Democrats pocket filibustered President Bush's nominee to that court, Peter Keisler, for 2 whole years. And this is according to our Democratic colleagues' own standards. Our colleagues are having the Senate spend time on this because doing so furthers their twin political goals. First, to quote a member of the Democratic leadership, to fill up that court because the President's agenda, according to an administration ally, runs through the D.C. Circuit. Second, to divert as much attention as possible from the problem-plagued Obamacare rollout at this formative stage of the 2014 campaign, according to published reports. In other words, rather than focusing on keeping their commitment to the American people, they're focusing on things that appeal to their base. Rather than change the law that is causing so many problems for so many, they want to change the subject. So unfortunately, the Senate will not be voting on legislation to allow Americans to keep their health insurance if they like it, as they were promised again and again and again. Rather, we will be voting on another nominee to a court that doesn't have enough work to do. The Senate ought to be spending its time dealing with a real crisis, not a manufactured one. We ought to be dealing with an ill-conceived law that is causing millions of Americans to lose their health insurance. Instead, we'll spend our time today on a political exercise designed to distract the American people from the mess that is Obamacare, rather than trying to fix it. Last week, I also suggested that if our Democratic colleagues are going to ignore the fact that millions of people are losing their health insurance plans, they should at least be working with us to fill judicial emergencies that actually exist, rather than complaining about fake ones. I noted there are nominees on the executive calendar who would fill actual judicial emergencies, unlike any of the D.C. Circuit nominations. Several of them, in fact, have been pending on the calendar longer than the nomination on which we'll be voting today. Another week has gone by without any action by the majority to fill these actual judicial emergencies. Rather than work with us to schedule votes on them in an orderly manner, as we have been doing, the majority chose to leapfrog over them in order to concoct crisis on the D.C. Circuit so it can distract Americans from the failings of Obamacare. Unfortunately, our friends appear to be more concerned with playing politics than with actually solving problems. So like last week, I'll vote no on this afternoon's political exercise. And as I said last week, I hope the Senate will focus on things the American people care about rather than spend its time trying to distract them. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Senator from Iowa.
The judge's nomination, the vote that we're having.
Senator is recognized.
I'm going to vote not to bring up the nomination of Judge Wilkins. I have some concerns about his record, but I'm not going to focus on those concerns today because there's a lot bigger issues that we're dealing with. I've said it before and I'll say it again. By the standard the Democrats established in the year 2006, we shouldn't confirm any more judges to the D.C. Circuit, especially when those additional judges cost approximately $1 million per year per judge. The fact of the matter is that this D.C. Circuit that they want to make 3 more appointments to, and this will be the 3rd of these appointments we've dealt with, that circuit is underworked. The statistics make it abundantly clear, but I'm not going to go through them all again as I have in the past. I will mention a couple brief points regarding the caseload. D.C. Circuit ranks last, for instance, in both the number of appeals filed and the appeals terminated. These are the cases coming to the court and going out. Not only does D.C. rank last, but it isn't even close. To give you a frame of reference, compare D.C. to the 11th Circuit, which has the highest caseload. The 11th has over 5 times as many appeals as filed here in the D.C. Circuit. The same is true for appeals terminated. Again, it isn't even close. The 11th Circuit has over 5 times as many appeals terminated as the D.C. Circuit. The bottom line is that the D.C. Circuit doesn't have enough work as it is right now, let alone if we were to add even more judges. In this case, the President's desire to add 3. That is why the current judges on the court, the current judges, have written to me and said things like, quote, if any more judges were added now, there wouldn't be enough work to go around. Now, as I've said last week, at least some on the other side concede that the D.C. Circuit's caseload is low. But they claim D.C.'s caseload numbers don't take into account the complexity of the court's docket based upon the number of administrative appeals filed in that circuit. But as I've said, this argument doesn't stand up against scrutiny. My colleagues argue that the D.C. Circuit docket is complex because 43% of its dockets is made up of administrative appeals. But of course, there is a reason they cite a percentage rather than a number, and that is because it is a high percentage of a very small number. When you look at the actual number of these so-called complex cases per judge, the Second Circuit has almost twice as many as the D.C. Circuit. In 2012, there were 512 administrative appeals filed in the D.C. Circuit, but in the Second Circuit, there were 1,493 filed. Stated differently, in D.C., there were only 64 administrative appeals per active judge. The Second Circuit has nearly twice as many with 115 filings. Again, that's 64 administrative appeals per judge in D.C. compared with almost twice as many with the Second Circuit at 115. So this entire argument about complexity, I hope, comes out to be nonsense to most of my colleagues. Now, to hear the other side tell it, it is an outrage that we would hold them to the same standards that they established in 2006 when they blocked Peter Keisler's nomination to the D.C. Circuit based upon caseload. Since that time, by the standard that the other side established, the court's caseload has declined even further. It has declined so much, in fact, that the number of appeals back then with 10 active judges is roughly the same as there are now with 8 active judges. Again, we didn't set this standard. The Democrats did. That standard may be inconvenient for Democrats today, but that is not a reason to abandon the standard that they established. And remember, the other side established the Chrysler standard after the so-called Gang of 14 agreement. So even if that agreement hadn't expired by its own terms at the end of the 109th Congress, the Democrats established the Chrysler standard after that agreement supposedly took effect. So, as I've said, the other side has run out of legitimate arguments in support of these nominations. That is why they seem to be grasping at straws. And when the other side grasps at straws, they get desperate. When the other side gets desperate, they turn to their last line of defense, accuse us Republicans of bias. Over the last week or so, my colleagues on the other side have argued that Republicans are opposing nominees based on gender. That argument, I said last week, and I still say, is offensive and patently absurd. It is so absurd, in fact, that even the Los Angeles Times called the Democrats' attempt to play the quote-unquote gender card a, quote, pretty bogus argument, end of quote, noting that in the past Republicans have, quote, happily confirmed female nominees. The fact of the matter is that the Republicans have supported over 80 women nominated to the bench by this president, as well as a host of other nominees of diverse backgrounds. Those are the facts. It's unfortunate, but sadly predictable, that facts may not mean much. These allegations of gender bias are unfortunate because they represent cheap attacks that the other side knows are untrue. But it also is unfortunate because the entire exercise is designed to create the appearance of a crisis where there is no crisis. There is no crisis in the D.C. Circuit because they don't have enough work to do as it is. But there is a crisis occurring right now all across the country as a result of the health care reform bill that often goes by the terminology of Obamacare. Millions of Americans are losing their health insurance, even though the president promised over and over again, you know the quote, if you like your health care, you can keep it. Even though we have a very real and a very serious crisis facing this country because of Obamacare, the other side is desperately trying to divert attention to anything but the Obamacare disaster. Here is how the roll call newspaper described the strategy. Quote, Senate Democrats are readying their negative assertive moves on three other issues important to their base: abortion rights, minimum wage, and the federal judiciary. The goal is to divert as much attention as possible away from the problem-plagued Obamacare rollout. End of roll call quote. So let me get this straight. Right now, a crisis is unfolding all across this country as millions of Americans are losing their health insurance because of Obamacare. Yet the Democrats' strategy, according to roll call, is to conceal the Obamacare crisis by using the D.C. Circuit as a smokescreen. That's breathtaking, even by Washington, D.C. standards. The other side is so eager to divert attention from the millions of Americans losing their insurance because of Obamacare that they're willing to manufacture a crisis in the D.C. Circuit, even though the current judges say things like, quote, if any more judges were added now, there wouldn't be enough work to go around, end of quote. Not only that, but after running out of legitimate arguments to justify the president's attempt to stack the deck on this court, the other side has resorted to making allegations of gender bias. I've already explained that these allegations are offensive and absurd, But since the other side's strategy is to conceal Obamacare train wreck with a D.C. Circuit smokescreen, and on top of that is willing to go so far as to accuse our side of gender bias, then I'm going to take the opportunity to share some of the frustrations being experienced by my constituents in Iowa, meaning women in Iowa, as a result of Obamacare. A woman in Vinton, Iowa writes, quote, "After 28 days of complete frustration, I got to look at 30 plans on the Iowa Healthcare Exchange at healthcare.com. The cheapest one is the $1,886 per year with a $6,300 deductible. Last year I spent $1,484 on health care, total out of my own pocket. I wouldn't even meet the deductible, paying about $350 a month on the one plan offered. At that rate, what I spent total last year would be spent on premiums in 4 months. With more and more policies being canceled at the insurance companies, with more and more doctors refusing to serve patients with Obamacare, and with the increasing anger towards elected officials, including President Obama, how do you plan to fix this mess?" End of quote. Another woman from Iowa, in Sioux City, writes, quote, "My company just had a meeting to inform us of the changes to our health care plan thanks to Obamacare. It's going to cost me $190 more each month next year for my family coverage. I'm going to have to work more overtime, reduce my 401k contribution, and opt out of my Flex 125 contributions to try to recover the extra money coming out of my paycheck because of new laws. While I suppose I should count myself lucky I didn't lose my employer health insurance coverage, I sure don't feel happy about the extra money I'm going to have to pay for the same coverage I was getting this year. What a joke. I wish there was something that I could be done about this. Socialize health care." Then she used a word that I can't repeat on the floor of the United States Senate. End of quote. A mom in Dayton, Iowa, quote, "Our family health insurance agency contacted us last week to set up an appointment to talk to us about the changes in our health coverage due to Obamacare. We went to the meeting and found out that our health savings account that we currently have will no longer be available because of Obamacare, plus our monthly rate will go from $350 a month to $570 a month. We have no idea how we're going to afford this increase. We feel blindsided. I know that you're committed to helping Iowans as well as all Americans, so I ask that you keep fighting for affordable health care." End of quote. And my final message from a woman in Melbourne, Iowa, writes, I got a full in-your-face understanding of just how horrible it was today when I went to renew my insurance. I currently pay $110 every 2 weeks for insurance for my whole family. Next year, I will have to pay over $500 every 2 weeks to insure my family. The health care website Obamacare created is no better. I can't even get the website to work properly. It will not allow me to put my husband on a joint policy with me. I actually have to weigh which is cheaper, paying the fine or paying for insurance. Sadly, it will probably be paying the fine, end of quote. So, Mr. President, these are real stories from real women facing a real crisis in just one state of the 50 states, my state of Iowa. And of course, this isn't happening only in my state, far from it. This is happening to millions of Americans all across the country. But rather than focus on this crisis, a real crisis, the other side has developed a strategy specifically designed to divert attention from it. That strategy is to use the D.C. Circuit as a smokescreen. So let me sum up. Even though the judges themselves say, quote, if any more judges were added now, there wouldn't be enough work to go around, end of quote. even though we shouldn't fill these seats based upon the Democrat standard set in 2006. And even though filling these seats would waste $3 million per year in taxpayers' money that we don't have, the other side seems, in an unreasonable way, bent upon manufacturing a crisis for cynical political reasons. I'd urge my colleagues on the other side to come to their senses. Let's start focusing on the real crisis facing this country. So I urge my colleagues to vote no on the cloture motion on the Wilkins nomination. I yield the floor. Suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President,
Senator from Kansas,
I ask the quorum call be lifted.
without objection.
Mr. President, thank you very much. Last month, I was at the World War II Memorial greeting a number of Kansans who had arrived on an honor flight, and certainly want to pay tribute to each of our servicemen and women and veterans, and what a great experience it was on a beautiful day at the memorial. One of those veterans was someone I want to talk about this evening to my colleagues here in the United States Senate. Getting off the bus that day was my friend and a former member of the United States House of Representatives for the 5th Congressional District of Kansas, Dick Nichols. There are many things I admire about Kansans. Folks from my home state, they always look out for others. They commit their lives to helping and improving the lives of their communities, of our state and our nation, in order to make certain that it's an even better opportunity for the next generation. And Dick Nichols, Congressman Nichols, is certainly one of those individuals, and I'd like to pay my regards to him today. Dick was born in Kansas. He was raised in Fort Scott and served during World War II as an ensign in the United States Navy. And after serving our nation with great integrity and humility, he pursued and achieved a bachelor's degree in science from Kansas State University in 1951. Congressman Nichols is a supporter of education, but particularly a supporter of education that comes from Kansas State University. He is a Wildcat through and through. Dick worked in a number of roles related to agriculture and banking in both Topeka and Hutchinson communities in our state before he moved to McPherson, his home now. And in McPherson, he began his career as a longtime community banker at the Home State Bank. He became president in 1969 of that bank. In 1986, he was elected to serve as president of the Kansas Bankers Association. That same year, Dick got some national notoriety. He was stabbed at the Staten Island ferry by a homeless refugee from Cuba while he was touring the Statue of Liberty, and while recuperating in the hospital, he was visited by then New York Mayor Ed Koch, who apologized on behalf of the city of New York for the event. And I always also remember that he was invited to the Johnny Carson show to tell his story of the Kansan at the Statue of Liberty and his experiences in New York City. But even during that particular event and what he said on the talk show and what he told Mayor Koch was that he always looked for the best in every person and in every situation. Dick continued as an active banker. He served as the president and the chairman of the board of his bank until he was elected to the United States Congress in 1990. Due to reapportionment in our state following the 1990 census, his district, the 5th District, was eliminated, and we went from 5 congressional districts to 4, and Dick returned back to the Home State Bank as chairman of its board. But whether he was a congressman representing the 5th, or a community banker in his hometown, or as an ensign in the U.S. Navy, Dick always put service to others above self-interest. He was involved in politics. Prior to his election in office to Congress, he was active in Kansas politics, and particularly Republican politics. And in my first campaign in 1996 for the U.S. House of Representatives, it was an honor for me to have him agree to serve as my campaign's honorary chairman. But in addition to his political involvement, Dick was so engaged in so many other things, many of them related to the community that he cares so much about, McPherson, Kansas. And it was the Chamber of Commerce and the Rotary Club. He became the commanding general of the Kansas Cavalry. That's a group of businessmen and women from across our state who band together to recruit and encourage new businesses to come to our state. And he continued to serve other servicemen and women and veterans through his membership and participation in the American Legion and VFW. Dick has often been quoted to say, "Much of life is in our mental attitude. If you think great things might happen, they do. if you question them ever happening, they won't. I agree with that sentiment, and I've seen Dick Nichols live that in his life. And because of his attitude and character, many, including me, were inspired not only to get to know him, but then to try to model our public service after his. In McPherson, there are few people more loved and respected than Dick Nichols, and it's a privilege for me to be able to call him a friend and mentor. When I initially ran for Congress and needed advice about his community and his county, he was the first person I reached out. And I always remember, as I was campaigning for the very first time for office to Congress, I had people tell me, if you're a friend of Dick Nichols, you're a friend of mine. And it's an opportunity we all ought to take to remember that how we conduct ourselves influence and affect so many others. While I know what happens here in the United States Senate, what happens in Washington, D.C. has huge consequences and effect upon Kansans and Americans, in fact, people around the globe, I continue to believe that we change the world one person at a time. And it happens in communities across my state and across the country. And Dick Nichols represents that kind of person who changes lives, in fact, changes the life of every person he meets. So today, having seen Dick Nichols just a few weeks ago at the World War II Memorial built in his and other World War II veterans' honor, I want to express my gratitude to Congressman Nichols for his service to his community, to our state of Kansas, and to our nation. And I use this opportunity to remind myself about the true nature of public service, about caring for other people. And I wish Dick and his wife Linda and their families all the very best. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I notice the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. And here on the floor of the Senate in a quorum call, earlier the Senate passed a bill on oversight of drug compounding centers. That bill is H.R. 3204, on its way to the President for his signature. It gives the FDA authority to inspect large volume compounders, though it doesn't require them to register with the FDA. And now debating the nomination of Robert Wilkins to the D.C. Court of Appeals. A vote on the nomination is expected to be held after 5:30 Eastern Time, and also a possible vote on taking up defense programs will be taken tonight. 60 votes needed for both of those to pass. Taking a look at some tweets from members of Congress as they're in a quorum call here on the Senate floor. Again, earlier they passed the Oversight of Drug Compounding Centers bill. It's on its way to the President for his signature. And they debated some of the nomination of Robert Wilkins to the D.C. Court of Appeals. And a vote on that nomination expected to be held after